John had visited that grave every month for 7 years. He would kneel, steady his breathing, and whisper the same apology. He believed his daughter was gone forever, taken by a house fire that left nothing but ash and a sealed casket. What he didn't know was that she was standing less than 100 feet away, hidden behind a line of trees, alive, breathing, and watching him cry for a death that never happened. Imagine believing you buried your child, feeling that loss harden into routine grief, only to learn later that the funeral was a lie. How could a child be alive after a confirmed burial? Who lied? And why would anyone do something like that? Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. 7 years earlier, John was not a millionaire, just a contractor working long hours, raising his daughter Lily alone after her mother passed away from illness. Their life was ordinary in the quiet way most real lives are. School runs, late dinners, the smell of sawdust clinging to John's clothes when he hugged her goodnight. On the night of the fire, John was out of town on a last-minute job. The call came just after midnight. The house had burned fast. Investigators said Lily was inside. Dental records matched. A closed casket funeral followed within days. John remembers thinking the speed was mercy. He also remembers the weight in his chest when the casket was lowered, how final it sounded when it touched the ground. Grief didn't explode. It settled. It became something he learned to carry quietly. What no one told John was that the investigation ended too cleanly. The woman who identified the body was his late wife's older sister, Margaret, a person John trusted without question. Margaret said she was there first, that she saw enough to know Lily was gone, that sparing John details was kindness. In reality, Margaret had arrived before the firefighters finished their sweep. Lily had been pulled out alive, unconscious, covered in soot. Margaret made a decision that night that would change every life involved. She told the responders the child wasn't Lily. She claimed custody disputes, confusion, panic. In the chaos, a mistake was recorded and a frightened system moved on. Lily was taken away, renamed, and raised as someone else. Margaret convinced herself she was protecting the child from instability, from a father she judged unfairly. Lily grew up believing her name was Emily. She was told her parents died, that questions were dangerous, that curiosity caused pain. Some nights, she dreamed of sawdust and a warm voice reading aloud. Margaret would stiffen when Emily asked about the past. "You're safe now," she'd say too quickly. Years passed. John's business succeeded. Work filled the silence. Money arrived, but relief didn't. He bought a larger house and never filled the second bedroom. Every month, he went to the cemetery. He spoke to the stone as if Lily could hear him. "I should have been there," he'd say. "I'm sorry I missed you." Grief aged him in small ways. He stopped laughing loudly. He learned to keep memories short so they wouldn't hurt as much. 6 months before the truth came out, Margaret fell ill. Hospital rooms strip away secrets because there's nowhere left to hide them. Emily was 19 when Margaret asked her to sit close and listen. The confession came in pieces, broken by coughs and pauses. There had been a fire, a man who loved her, a name that wasn't hers. Emily felt the floor tilt. Her first thought wasn't anger. It was confusion. "So I'm not who I thought I was," she whispered. Margaret cried, not with relief, but with fear of what she'd done. She died 3 weeks later, leaving behind documents, hospital records, and a letter addressed to John that was never sent. Emily found it while sorting papers, her hands shaking as she read the name she'd only just learned was hers. John received a call from a social worker on a Tuesday afternoon. He assumed it was a mistake. He nearly hung up. When they said Lily's name, his ears rang. The meeting was arranged carefully, with professionals in the room, words chosen to avoid shock. It didn't help. When Emily walked in, John stood without thinking. He didn't recognize her face, but he recognized the way she tilted her head when she was nervous. That small habit collapsed 7 years of certainty. No one spoke for a long moment. Emily finally said, "I think you're my dad." John felt his knees weaken. Grief didn't disappear. It transformed into something louder. Relief tangled with anger, and guilt rose because part of him felt joy where pain used to be. The turning point wasn't the reunion. It was the visit to the cemetery together, 2 weeks later. Emily stood behind John as he knelt. She listened to the apology he'd practiced for years. When he finished, she spoke softly. "You didn't miss me," she said. "I was taken." John pressed his forehead to the stone and cried in a way he never had before. They didn't remove the marker. They let it stay, a reminder of what belief can do to a life. Over the next year, they learned each other slowly. Birthdays felt awkward. Memories didn't line up. Therapy helped. Time helped more. John learned that loving an adult child is different from raising one, and Emily learned that grief can exist alongside gratitude. If this were you, what would you feel first? Anger at the person who lied, or relief that the loss wasn't real? Would you forgive? Could you? Stories like this happen because ordinary people make decisions they believe are right and refuse to question them later. John and Emily still visit the cemetery sometimes, not out of sadness, but as proof of how fragile truth can be and how strong people can be when it finally comes out. If you were standing there, listening to an apology meant for a ghost, would you step forward, or would you need time to be seen? John was known publicly as a successful man, but that was never how he saw himself. In his own mind, he was just a father who failed on the one night it mattered most. Before the money, before the larger house, before his name meant anything, his life revolved around small routines that only parents notice. He remembered sitting on the edge of Lily's bed every night, pretending not to be tired while she asked for one more story, remembered how she insisted on brushing her own teeth even though toothpaste always ended up on her pajamas. On her 7th birthday, he promised he'd leave work early next time, promised it so casually that it felt safe to say. He broke that promise more times than he could count, and after the fire, those broken promises replayed louder than any happy memory. In the quiet moments, John imagined who Lily would be now. He did the math without realizing it, picturing her as a teenager rolling her eyes at him, or maybe already in college, calling home less often than he hoped. He wondered what music she'd like, whether she'd still hate broccoli, whether she'd inherited her mother's habit of humming while thinking. These thoughts didn't comfort him. They punished him. He carried a thin, faded bracelet in his pocket, one she made at school out of cheap plastic beads, the string fraying from years of being handled. He told himself he kept it to remember her, but deep down, it was penance. Every time his fingers touched it, the same thought followed. If I had been home, this wouldn't have happened. The night of the fire became frozen in his mind, replayed with impossible revisions. If he had canceled the trip, if he had called earlier, if he had trusted his instincts instead of chasing one more contract. He blamed himself so thoroughly that there was no space left to question anyone else. When Stella, his wife at the time, insisted the cremation should happen quickly, he didn't argue. She said waiting would only make the pain worse. When Mark, his older son from a previous relationship, stepped in to handle the insurance paperwork, John felt relief, not suspicion. He didn't read every page. He didn't attend every meeting. Grief made decisions feel heavy, and letting others decide felt like rest. Looking back, there were moments that didn't quite fit, but grief smoothed their edges. The fire investigation closed faster than he expected, explained away as an unfortunate but clear case. Officials spoke in calm voices, using words like conclusive and accidental. John nodded because nodding was easier than asking questions that might reopen the wound. He told himself that professionals knew better, that families like his didn't get special treatment, that tragedies were messy but honest. He never questioned the speed, never asked why certain details were missing, never wondered why no one encouraged him to see more, no more. Because who would lie about a child's death? And more importantly, why would anyone let a father believe it was his fault if it wasn't? For 12 years, the story belonged to John. And then, without warning, it didn't. Because while he was kneeling at a gravestone, there was a girl standing across the road, close enough to see the lines in his face, far enough to remain unseen. Her name, at least the one she answered to now, was Isabella. She was 16, tall for her age, quiet in the way people become when they've learned that asking questions only leads to trouble. She lived under a different last name, in a different town, with a life that looked normal from the outside. School, chores, a part-time job on weekends. Nothing about her suggested she was supposed to be dead. And yet, every few months, she found herself drawn back to that place, watching a man she had been told to forget. Isabella didn't remember everything about the fire, but what she did remember came back in flashes, usually when she smelled smoke or heard sirens in the distance. Heat pressing against her skin, the sound of glass breaking, strong arms pulling her through darkness while she coughed and screamed for her dad. She remembered waking up later in a hospital bed, her throat raw, her body aching, and a woman sitting beside her who wasn't her mother. The woman spoke softly, too softly. She told Isabella there had been an accident, that things had gone wrong, that her father wasn't coming. When Isabella cried and asked why, the answer came sharp and final. He didn't want you. He chose his work. That sentence settled into her life like a scar. It explained everything adults did afterward, the sudden move, the new name, the rules about the past. Isabella learned quickly that survival depended on acceptance. She stopped asking to see her old house. She stopped asking about the man whose face she could no longer clearly remember, but whose absence felt loud. At night, she replayed the moment she'd been carried from the fire, wondering why she'd been saved if no one wanted her. That question followed her into her teenage years, shaping how she trusted people, how she loved, how she prepared herself for disappointment before it arrived. The first time Isabella saw John again, she didn't know it was him. She was 13, riding her bike past the cemetery on the way home from school, when she noticed a man kneeling alone, talking to a gravestone. Something about his posture slowed her down. He looked familiar in a way she couldn't place, like a half-remembered dream. When she read the name on the stone, her chest tightened. Her real name, the one she was told never to use. She went home shaken, told herself it was coincidence, told herself the past couldn't reach forward and grab her. But it did. Over time, she started watching from a distance, learning his schedule, standing where she could hear pieces of his voice carried by the wind. She listened to him apologize for things she didn't understand. She heard love in his voice, not indifference. And slowly, painfully, the story she had been given began to crack. If he didn't want her, why did he come here every month? If he had chosen work over her, why did his hands shake when he spoke her name? Isabella felt something shift inside her, a mix of anger and longing that kept her awake at night. She didn't step forward. She wasn't ready. Because if she was alive, and he was grieving, then someone, somewhere, had decided she should disappear. And the question she couldn't escape was simple and terrifying. If Isabella survived the fire, who decided she should vanish? And what else had they been willing to lie about? The official report called it an accident, the kind of word that closes conversations and lets people sleep at night. But when the pieces were examined slowly, without grief rushing the answers, the story began to fracture. The fire didn't spread the way accidental fires usually do. It moved with direction, feeding upward instead of outward, as if it had been guided. The back door showed signs of being secured from the outside, a small detail dismissed early because no one wanted to believe it mattered. And the smoke alarm in the hallway outside Isabella's room had been disabled, its battery removed days earlier, not damaged by heat, not melted, simply gone. Each of these details existed on paper, buried in technical language, overlooked because the conclusion had already been chosen. Once a child is declared dead, the system rarely looks backward. John never saw those details. He was spared them, or so it was said, to protect his mental state. Stella handled most of the conversations with investigators, her voice calm, her answers quick. She said Isabella had been asleep when the fire started, said there was no struggle, no sound, nothing that could have warned anyone in time. It sounded merciful. It sounded clean. Mark, already an adult then, was the last person seen near Isabella's room that night, something noted but never emphasized. He said he'd checked on her earlier, said she was fine, said he'd gone to bed shortly after. No one pushed harder. Families are given the benefit of the doubt, especially grieving ones. And when Stella insisted on cremation, saying she couldn't bear the thought of the body remaining intact, the request was granted without resistance. But Isabella was alive when the fire started. Medical notes from the emergency room, later sealed, described soot in her lungs, burns consistent with exposure, a pulse detected before transport. She had been breathing. She had been awake. Someone knew that. Someone stood between that truth and John, and chose silence instead. The accident wasn't an accident at all. It was a decision layered with other decisions, each one easier to justify than the last, each one harder to undo. And the most disturbing detail wasn't the locked door or the missing alarm. It was this. While flames filled the house and smoke stole the air from her lungs, Isabella was alive, conscious enough to be saved, and someone made sure the world believed she wasn't. The funeral was presented as mercy, but in truth it was convenience dressed as compassion. Stella insisted on a closed casket, telling John that seeing what the fire had done would only haunt him. He didn't argue. He barely spoke. The service moved quickly, the kind of efficiency that feels helpful when you're numb. A small group attended. Words like angel and rest were repeated until they lost meaning. What John didn't know was that the dental records used to confirm the identity weren't Isabella's at all. They belonged to an unrelated victim from a separate incident weeks earlier, quietly substituted and signed off without scrutiny. A local official, already under financial pressure, accepted money to move paperwork along, to stamp certainty where doubt should have lived. It wasn't elaborate. It didn't need to be. Systems fail most easily when people expect them to work. This is the part that hurts to sit with, because it means the failure wasn't just one person's decision. It was layered. Investigators trusted documents. Clerks trusted signatures. Family members trusted each other. And in that chain of trust, a child disappeared. John stood at a graveside mourning a daughter who was learning how to survive without him, moving through foster homes and temporary guardianships, always told to be grateful, always reminded not to ask questions. While he carried a bracelet in his pocket and whispered apologies into the ground, Isabella learned how to pack her belongings quickly, how not to get attached, how to keep memories quiet so they wouldn't be taken away too. Everyone thought someone else was responsible, and because of that, no one truly was. But the people who arranged that funeral, who signed those papers and rushed that process, made one mistake they never accounted for. They assumed memory fades the same way records do. They believed time would erase details. They were wrong. Isabella remembered the sound of the door clicking shut. She remembered the hallway light being off when it was usually on. She remembered coughing, screaming, and realizing no one was coming. Those memories didn't disappear. They waited. And as she grew older, they sharpened, aligning with truths she overheard, with inconsistencies she noticed, with the man she saw kneeling at a grave that should never have existed. That was the mistake. Isabella remembered everything. And memory, when it finally finds proof, doesn't stay silent for long. When the money trail was finally laid out, the truth hardened into something cold and unmistakable. Isabella's declared death triggered an immediate shift in inheritance, one that had been prepared quietly, patiently. Assets that would have been held in trust for her were released instead, redirected under emergency provisions meant for surviving spouses and dependents. Stella gained control almost overnight, not just of finances, but of decisions, properties, futures. Mark, listed as the next direct heir, stepped into a position of security he had never expected so soon. None of it looked suspicious on the surface. It followed the rules. It followed the paperwork. It followed a story everyone had already accepted. And that was the point. This wasn't greed in the simple sense people like to imagine, the kind driven by sudden temptation or reckless desire. It was something quieter and more deliberate. It was replacement. Isabella wasn't just removed from the family. She was substituted. Her absence made space for a cleaner structure, fewer complications, a future that could be managed without uncertainty. Stella spoke often about stability, about protecting what remained, about moving forward instead of clinging to what was lost. Mark echoed those words, presenting himself as responsible, dependable, the one who would carry things forward. Together, they built a version of the family where Isabella no longer existed, not as a memory, not as a beneficiary, not as a person whose needs had to be considered. John trusted them because trust felt easier than suspicion. He signed where he was told to sign. Initialed pages he couldn't fully read through tears, believing the people closest to him wouldn't exploit the worst moment of his life. But one signature mattered more than all the others, one document that made everything official, irreversible. The declaration that closed the case, released the funds, and sealed Isabella's fate on paper. And the person John trusted most, the one who held his hand and told him to rest, signed it without hesitation. For years, Isabella carried the truth alone, watching from a distance while the man she was told had abandoned her returned to the same place, month after month. She learned his routine without meaning to. The way he arrived early, before the groundskeeper finished his rounds. The way he stood quietly for a moment before kneeling, as if preparing himself. She heard the words he thought no one else could hear, apologies spoken softly, repeatedly, like a prayer that never changed. He didn't speak like a man who had chosen work over a child. He spoke like someone who believed he had failed in the worst possible way. And each time, something inside Isabella tightened, pulling her between anger and recognition. The question she couldn't escape followed her home, followed her into sleep. If he truly believed she was dead, then had he ever abandoned her at all? The story she'd been given began to lose its weight, replaced by a heavier one. The possibility that her entire life had been shaped by a lie meant to erase her. She imagined stepping forward, saying his name, watching his face change as the impossible became real. She also imagined the consequences, the questions, the unraveling of everything she'd known. Truth isn't just revelation. It's destruction. And Isabella wasn't sure she was ready to be the one who caused it. One afternoon, As she stood near the trees longer than usual, someone noticed. A groundskeeper slowed his cart, glancing at her more than once. Later, a woman visiting another grave looked at her, then back at John, then at her again, confusion flickering across her face. Isabella felt the familiar instinct to disappear, the reflex learned from years of being told to stay invisible. But the space between her and John felt smaller now, charged with something she could no longer ignore. She knew the choice wouldn't wait forever. Either she would step forward, or someone else would connect the dots for her. And once that happened, there would be no way to control how the truth came out. The moment didn't happen the way movies promise it will. There was no dramatic announcement, no shouting, no running toward each other. It happened quietly, almost accidentally. Isabella stepped closer than she ever had before, close enough for John to notice a small movement, close enough for him to see her hands trembling as she held something between her fingers. A thin bracelet, faded plastic beads, the string worn soft with age. The same bracelet John carried in his pocket every single day. He didn't understand what he was seeing at first. His mind rejected it before his heart could react. Then recognition landed all at once, heavy and undeniable. Time seemed to pause as he looked from the bracelet to her face, searching for confirmation in her eyes. Silence stretched, thick and fragile, until it broke under the weight of tears neither of them tried to stop. John's knees gave out, grief and hope colliding too fast for his body to hold. What followed was chaos disguised as order. Someone called for help. Someone else called the police. Isabella didn't need to explain much. Records she'd quietly gathered over the years spoke for her. Hospital notes, altered documents, names that didn't match. The case that had been closed for over a decade reopened within days, and this time, it wasn't guided by convenience or assumptions. Investigators retraced steps with new eyes, questioned decisions that had once been waved through. Stella was taken in first, her calm unraveling under scrutiny she could no longer control. Mark followed soon after, and when pressure mounted, he chose himself. He told everything he knew, everything he'd helped bury, trading loyalty for leniency. The truth moved quickly once it was allowed to move at all, and there was no putting it back. John and Isabella were left standing in the aftermath, surrounded by answers that came too late and consequences that arrived too suddenly. The reunion was real, but it wasn't clean. Years had been stolen, replaced with silence and blame that never belonged to either of them. As authorities worked to untangle the damage, one fact stood clear and immovable. A father had mourned a child who was alive, and a daughter had grown up believing she was unwanted, all because the people closest to them chose paper over truth. And now that truth was exposed, impossible to ignore, and far more powerful than anyone who tried to erase it. The truth, once exposed, didn't arrive as revenge. It arrived as release. Courtrooms and headlines followed, but those details mattered less than what happened quietly, away from cameras and paperwork. Stella faced consequences that could no longer be delayed or softened. Mark's cooperation spared him the worst outcomes, but not the weight of what he had helped destroy. Systems that once failed were forced to answer for their silence. None of it restored the years that were taken, but it did something just as important. It acknowledged that what happened was wrong, and that the child at the center of it all had been erased on purpose, not lost by chance. Isabella reclaimed her name officially, signing it again and again until it felt real in her hands, until it belonged to her without explanation. For John, the hardest moment wasn't learning what others had done. It was accepting what he had believed. One evening, sitting across from Isabella in a quiet room that still felt unfamiliar, he finally said the words he'd been holding back. He apologized, not for leaving that night, not for working too much, but for trusting a lie because it hurt less than questioning it. He told her he should have fought harder for the truth, even when grief made standing difficult. Isabella listened without interrupting, her own emotions layered and complex. Forgiveness didn't arrive all at once, but understanding did. And in that understanding, something steadier began to form. A future built on honesty, not on missing years, but on the choice to stop letting lies define who they were. Sometimes the deepest betrayals don't come from strangers. They come from the people we trust the most, the ones who promise protection, who hold our lives in their hands, who shape our understanding of love and safety. John and Isabella's story reminds us that betrayal can be quiet, hidden in paperwork, in whispered reassurances, in decisions made under the guise of care. And yet, it also reminds us that truth has a way of finding its way back, even when it seems impossible. Would you forgive a betrayal like this? Could you rebuild trust after years of lies and loss? And do you think a parent ever truly stops grieving, even when the child they mourn is standing right in front of them? These are not easy questions, and they don't have easy answers. But they force us to reflect on our own lives, our own families, and the value of honesty in the relationships we hold most dear. If this story stayed with you, like it stayed with us, like the video, share it, and subscribe for more stories where truth finally comes to light.